All right, let's roll, gentlemen. Welcome to the 37th episode of The Smartest People in the Room. If you've been following this series, you understand what we are doing, shining a light on incredibly smart, accomplished people and helping them share stories from their careers and lives, as well as anecdotes about their past, present, and future. Today, I am pleased to welcome two highly accomplished and well-known, respected music business all-stars to our program. And they happen to also be next-door neighbors. There must be something in the water in that area for two such accomplished execs to be living next to each other. Before we get started, let me take care of some business. First, to the audience, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat window. The reason we do these webinars is twofold. First, we want to showcase really smart people and the amazing work they do day to day in the music industry. But the second reason is a bit more nuanced. Most of you know I am a music industry headhunter. By definition and function, I help people connect with companies. In this series, my goal is to help you make more connections, and I invite you to take full advantage of that opportunity. Specifically, I invite you to engage with the speakers and the other attendees in the chat of the Zoom. Please introduce yourselves, say hello to your friends, and make some new ones. And ask questions of our speakers. We will try to address as many of those questions along the way. Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors. I want to thank First Horizon Bank, Bufkin Baker, Four Roses Bourbon, the Fairlane Hotel, the Tennessee Entertainment Commission, Lightning 100, Tennessee Brew Works, Moo TV, Jive Printing, Project Music, and Cushmasters. Cushmasters, by the way, is a great brand of CBD products. More on that later. So let's get down to business. Today's interviewer is my good friend, David Hazen. David is head of North America for MEDEM, a leading industry event servicing the global music community held in Cannes, France. David's deep music marketing experience includes senior positions held at the Orchard, Universal Music Group, Wind Up Entertainment, Warner Music Group, MTV Networks, and Putumayo World Music. He consulted with more than 2 dozen tech, brand, and media event and festival clients, including CID Entertainment, Fest Ticket, and the Ottawa Blues Fest, as well as O Cannabis, Grow Up, and Canadian Music Week conferences, where he produced multiple events, panels, and hackathons. Earlier, David held senior positions at leading experiential marketing agencies such as US Concepts / MKTG, UG Strategies, and the groundbreaking sponsorship agency EMCI Rockbill, where he ran their London, UK office. He's a frequent speaker, interviewer, and moderator at leading industry events around the world, including IEG, South by Southwest, Music Biz, Canadian Music Week, Mondo, Music Tectonics, X Live, Fest Forums, SF Music Tech, and MUCON, among others. Welcome, David. And joining David as today's featured guest is Richard Gottehrer. The song is Where It All Starts. And within a minute of speaking to Richard Gottehrer, co-founder and chief creative officer of The Orchard, there is no doubt in your mind that you are talking to a musical legend. A true visionary who's used the power of a song to navigate through many chapters of his career, from composing and producing hit songs such as My Boyfriend's Back, I Want Candy, and Sorrow, to co-founding Sire Records with Seymour Stein, producing hits with acts such as Blondie, Richard Hell, Robert Gordon and the Link Ray, the Go-Go's, and beyond, straight to the founding of The Orchard. He's done it all, and he has the stories to prove it. Please welcome these amazing guests to the smartest people in the room. Take it away, David.
Hey, everybody. Greetings from the Hudson Valley. Richard and I live next door to each other. We were going to do this outside, but nature seemed to have had something different in mind on this rainy day. But I'm pleased and privileged to be speaking with my friend and neighbor here, Richard Gottehrer. Richard, your story is unique in the industry. You were a writer in the 60s, a label mogul in the 70s, a star producer in the 80s, and a digital visionary in the 90s. You made essential contributions to every single decade in the latter half of the 20th century, where each one of those contributions was specific to that decade. No one else has done that, and that wasn't in the bio. So I wanted to make that point first. Let's get started. There's a lot of ground to cover, guys. Richard, what was your earliest musical memory before Elvis and the Beatles, what was it that really moved you, that got you, that made you feel you were going to have an incredible connection with music for the rest of your life?
Well, I started off as a classical piano player. And the interesting part about that is I had to take lessons from the time I was 5 years old. And without getting political about it, I had a woman who is the classical piano teacher. She was a Russian lady. And she had used discipline as a teaching tool. So as you'd play, you'd be playing, and God forbid you hit a wrong note. She had a ruler, bam! So I learned very early on not to make that many mistakes. So, but what that led me to was getting rid of my feeling for that kind of music and getting into learning to play boogie woogie piano, which I got off of listening to swing music, St. Louis Blues Boogie, and listening, believe it or not, Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, people from that era that crossed over, and then Enlightenment, Alan Freed. When radio was important and really meant something to a little kid, I was 14 years old when I first heard Alan Freed on WINS in New York, and changed my life. You know, I learned about what we didn't call it black music then, sepia, R&B. We had other terms, but basically, white Jewish kid, middle class kid from the Bronx, hearing that stuff changed my life.
That's great. When you were writing your first hits, there's this whole myth around the Brill Building when you were in there, and tell us what that was like and what the vibe was like around there, and with the Beatles kind of on the horizon and in the process of changing everything.
Well, the Beatles weren't really on the horizon. I mean, they probably to this day think it was a miracle that anything happened for them. You know, it could easily have just gone the other way, you know, as it did for a lot of bands. But the Brill Building is a building that actually exists on 49th Street and Broadway. And when they talk about the Brill Building, they mean that building and the area around that part of Manhattan. And it also included 1650 Broadway and 1697, where the David Letterman show was, and now Stephen Colbert show. Anyway, you could walk from office to office and just knock on a door and say you had a song, and a publisher, an independent record company would listen, and maybe they would like the song and sign it, and then show it to recording artists. That was the way it worked. Most artists, until the Beatles came along, really didn't really write and record their own material. Basically, you would write the songs for a specific artist, they would record it. And that was a traditional music business dating back to the Tin Pan Alley days and before that. The publishers really held sway because they would contribute the songs to the artists.
So part of what has kept your classics like I Want Candy, My Boyfriend's Back in the public consciousness is all of the commercials and movie and TV licenses. What's your favorite sync for which of your songs?
Well, it's funny, going back to that, to answer your question, when you're a kid and you write these songs, and at that time, you really didn't think of them being used in commercials or TV or used for anything. You hoped they would come out, get on the radio, and maybe become some level of a hit. We were fortunate, myself, Bob Feldman, and Jerry Goldstein. We formed a company called FGG Productions, which still exists today, a publishing company called Grand Canyon Music, which publishes songs like Sorrow and Nighttime. And but we started as songwriters, purely knowing nothing about publishing or anything else. And those songs, like My Boyfriend's Back, I Want Candy, when they came out, we hoped they'd get on the radio and become hits. Now you're looking at 56 to 60 years later, where the value is astronomically beyond what we earned when the songs came out and became hits. And it's almost ridiculous to think that those two songs, for example, have crossed the decades and become hits over and over again, but used in commercials and TV. And to answer your question, my boyfriend's back. For the last 30 years, the Hess truck has come back across the East Coast every Christmas. The Hess truck's back, and you're going to buy. And it's basically a truck, an emergency vehicle. And every year, it was Hess gasoline. Now they no longer have the stations, so they just have the trucks that they sell on the internet. And now we've expanded the deal, which is going to go 10 years into the future. And the earnings for that are really, really amazing for songwriters. So you write songs today, you should feel good about the value that you create, and you never know what's going to happen as it gets used on and on into the future.
That's great. What are some of the things that you had to do to get your records played on the radio in those days, in those more innocent times?
Well, you have to remember, when we were like in our early 20s, we would put out individual records ourselves. Now, my boyfriend's back, we didn't really do anything with, but nor I Want Candy for that matter, because they were signed to record companies. But there were things that we would do to promote our product individually. Now, we knew that at that time, the Northeast was the area where you could break pop records. By the Northeast, I mean, you couldn't get played in New York right away, but you would chase New Haven, Springfield, Massachusetts, Hartford, Albany, going up to Schenectady and Buffalo. And there are two things that we used to do. Because we were young, and there was a woman in New Haven that I remember at the local station there. Her name was Bertha Porter. And she took a liking to us, and she would listen to the records we put out. But you had to be really careful and make sure that you screwed up the B-side. And because if you wanted the A-side played, say My Boyfriend's Back, for example, the B-side is a song called Love Me Now. And if one takes it out and listens to it, you can hear yelling and chairs being thrown, anything to distract your interest from playing the song. So we would go and see Bertha, but my idea of payola, because we didn't have a lot of money, was we found out she liked Dr. Brown's celery tonic. So we would bring a case of Dr. Brown's celery tonic. Those who come from New York know it's part of the Jewish deli tradition. And we would do that and give it to her, and she would listen to the records. She wouldn't play them if she didn't really like them. And another thing we would do that's really fun is we would produce a record and then master it and want to know what it sounded like on the radio before we've accepted the final mastering and the pressing. So what we would do is we made friends with these DJs at KBW, that's Buffalo. Now, Buffalo, New York, KBW was a 50,000 watt station. So 50,000 watts could blast pretty far. So we found out where in some area of Queens or Long Island where there was a space where we could hear it. What we would do it as inducement to them to play the record for us so we could hear it was not just ask them as friends. There was a very famous cheesecake that was sold at Jack Dempsey's. It was a restaurant owned by the famous boxing legend Jack Dempsey in the Brill Building. So we would buy a cheesecake, pack it, have it packed in dry ice, put the master reference in the box, send it to KBW. They would enjoy the cheesecake, and that was the bribe in order for them to play the record so we could hear it. Again, no guarantee they were going to add the record to the playlist, but we would be able to hear what it sounded like and perhaps make it a better recording experience than it might have been had we not been able to listen to it. So that's payola from my infant sense.
So last question from this period. What was the moment where you really felt like you made it, like you'd hit the big time, like you were a success?
Oh, well, it was my boyfriend's back. Everyone was hiring us and wanted us to make records. And then we're writing songs and we're making more girl group records. And it turns out our relationship gets damaged with the artists, the Angels. We're writing songs and they're starting to be covered by British artists who are bouncing them back to us. And now they're still taking Brill Building songs as the Beatles and other artists from the UK emerge. And we're talking here 1960, 64. And what happens is little by little, they start writing their own songs and we start becoming less and less popular in what we're doing as producers. So again, we have to sort of invent ourselves. And that reinvention after the highlight where we thought we made it really big morphs down into nothingness. And then you got to come up with another thing to do. And what it turned out we became was Australian. We couldn't be British, so we became Australian and became a group that called ourselves the Strangeloves. And I think we had a record out with a fake British narration in the center of it. And eventually that led us to a relationship with Bert Burns and the writing of I Want Candy, which again, we made it. You know, I Want Candy became a really big hit and became a hit several times ongoing over the years. But it was turning Australian, touring the country, that allowed us to participate in the business as it was then becoming. The Brill Building was becoming a thing of the past. The world was now opening up.
And what were those lyrics in I Want Candy really about?
Well, it's funny because what we had was the beat, the boom, 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 boom. And we took that, there's 3 or 4 sets of drums, me banging on these African hair drums. If anybody wants to look up the Strangeloves album cover, you will see these drums that were taken from a studio, and we said they were Maasai war drums in Australian zebra skin, you know, and it was accepted that way for a while. But the thing that was interesting about it was we needed a lyric to go with it. And while we were sitting around writing, there were Bob Feldman, myself, Jerry Goldstein, and the great legendary Bert Burns. If anybody out there is unfamiliar with his history, you should get to it right away. I mean, he's a true legend that died well before his time in the music business. And there was a softcore porn book. It really wasn't porn, but in 1964 America, what we see displayed today was pure pornography. So in 64, a book was banned. It was written by a man named Terry Southern, and the book was called Candy. Well, there you go. I want candy. And then we write words about a descriptive nature of a girl who might have been Candy. And that was about it. Record comes out, and within a relatively short period of time, it's selling. It gets into the top 10 in Billboard Cashbox, but gets to #1 in a number of different cities. The thing I point out is, if you don't know it or don't remember it, that distribution was quite a bit different. Well, I'm in distribution now, but it was quite a bit different because every city had a major distributor. Every major city had a major distributor, and they didn't cross ship. So basically, you had to deal with people in all the major cities, and they serviced the radio stations. They had promotion people. Marketing was not really a term that we adhere to. Is radio promotion, and each distributor had a promotional setup.
So let's go back into the studio now. One of the major developments in the 60s was the shift from mono to stereo. What was that like for you? How did you navigate that complete radical change in making records?
Well, you you live in the moment. You figure out what it is you have to do in order to participate in what's going on around you. But I will say that I know we remember Phil Spector, the Beach Boys, and people today. I mean, that
mono.
Think of mono. Now the thing about mono that was amazing is that's where the real joyous noise comes from. That makes a record incredible. Today, you hear everything, so everything has to be right. And while it's what music is today and what makes music today great, what really makes great music great are the things that's wrong with it. When something is slightly out of tune and something else is differently slightly out of tune, they sound in tune together in a way that isn't perfection. And that's what made mono recordings great. The noises come together and you experience this overwhelming sound that makes what I call a joyous noise that can only be accomplished in that moment. And that's what made mono recording great. Now, what made stereo recording great is you could hear the different elements separated, so you could distinguish what was going on. What that implied was that you better get it right. And you worked a bit more to try to get to the point of perfection, because if people are really hearing every element, you want it to be right then. It can't be disguised the way it was in a mono recording, where the noises just came together and they made up one sound.
Did that pursuit of perfection rob some recordings of their emotional value, in your opinion?
Well, you had to create the emotional values in another way. Singers had to be more deliberate. They had to learn. I mean, with multi-track recording, remember, when recordings were made mono and 2-track in the early days, and even 4-track and mixed down, you had you could change some things, but you couldn't change them all. When multi-track recording, 8-track, 12-track, 24-track, 48-track, as we expanded and expanded, you could punch in. You could get down to syllables and redo them over and over again. And I got to be crazy like that. Everything had to be perfect. But I'm making a record it was in Brussels. It was this great band. I'll try to think of their name now, but the singer was named Bea. And And we're in the studio and she's singing. I stop her and say, Bayer, could you do this line again? Could you do that again? And all of a sudden the engineer says in a French, I'll give a fake French Belgian accent, but Richard, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm trying to get this right. He says, but aren't the mistakes what make it interesting? Yeah, mistakes make it interesting as long as they're not offensive to your ear. If everything is perfect, it's not really anything. It's not real. But we're living in a world today where we accept different realities. I still want to be seduced into things. I don't want to be hit over the head by what's right or wrong. And I think that's what makes music great, is how do you find the seductive qualities? If I would take a modern person that I would point out, and everybody would say the same thing, I imagine, I would say Billie Eilish and her brother. I mean, they found this way of expressing themselves where you touch on perfection, but it's so deep and internal that you feel their message in a different way. And that I think is what makes the two of them truly great. And the songs they sing and the subject matters they choose are not the contemporary pop formats that I would have chosen in the past, but I can understand it. And that appeals to me. Another thing that appeals to me, and the record could have been made in 1965. And frankly, it probably was. Old Town Road. You know, I mean, Lil Nas X. That record's not that record could have been made in the 60s, could have been made in the 50s. Okay, sonically, it touches it, but the parts, what he's saying, how he says it, has an older feeling. So what does it tell you? That old is new again if you translate it into some sort of modern format. Dreams, a TikTok video with a guy, well, with dreams playing in the background, and he's doing whatever he's doing, and all of a sudden, a new generation of people realize that one of the greatest bands of all time actually existed. That they were basically out of our memory, not out of my memory, but out of the memory of a 15-year-old, 16-year-old who had no reason to experience them. So what you see is these things come back again, and they can come back in from a modern format, translating and informing. To me, radio was the way I got my information. That's not how you get your information anymore. And it's great to grow through this and learn that these changes happen. If I would say anything makes me smart, which I don't consider myself necessarily the smartest person in any room, I consider myself one of the luckiest people in any room, because I was able to navigate through the changes and fortunate enough to adapt and stay in the game until luck can hit you on the head. If you're not in the game and you're not doing good things, at least, even though you're not succeeding in that moment, luck can always strike you. And that's what changes everything. And don't let anybody tell you they're so brilliant and smart. That's all bullshit. The ones that are really smart are smart and lucky, you know, and you got to put the two together.
And also something you did that most other people are not willing to do is wipe the slate clean, reinvent yourself, get involved with something well outside of your comfort zone based on what you had done at that time. And that's why I think you've been able to consistently come back in a totally different medium 4 times in a row in 4 decades.
I would say, like, I'm a wind up, what do you call it? The battery that keeps on ticking. I honestly, I mean, I just, I just don't even think about that. I think about the journey from starting in the music business, and writing songs, and then um, moving with the changes. It's just one journey. Eventually, we'll get to it. It's going to lead me to meet Scott Cohn, and we start the orchard. You know.
We got to get to CBGB before we get to the orchard.
Okay,
Stick to the path.
So after I Want Candy, and we discovered the McCoys, and Hang On Sloopy, which was a huge hit. We started, Bob, Jerry, and myself stopped writing songs that much together, and I decided I wanted to do something else. And Jerry was moving to California, and during the course of promoting Hang On Sloopy by the McCoys, they hired a promotion man. And the promotion person knew where a lot of bodies were buried and how to get things on the radio and listed on the charts. His name was Seymour Stein. We became friends. And when FGG split up, I went into business with him, and we started a production company called Sire, which was Seymour Richard. First letter of Seymour, second letter of Richard, first letter of Richard, second letter of Seymour. That became Sire. And we did some productions, and then somehow morphed into, we got some investment and morphed into a record label. The first distributor for it was London Records. And the model for the label was basically to be independent and to model it after early Elektra or Vanguard. You could make folk music inexpensively. We did some folk albums, and they were all good. If anybody wants to look into Sire, you could look into the history of it, look into those early records. They're interesting from that perspective. And then we started thinking, what else? What else was, we went to Europe, went to the export divisions of the major record companies. Now, you have to remember, the major record companies all had export divisions. For example, EMI. EMI had the Beatles. Now, this is 1967, 66, 67. EMI had the Beatles, but Capitol Records in the United States was not interested in releasing the Beatles. They didn't see it. The first three Beatle records, or at least the first two, one, She Loves You, was on Swan. Please Please Me was on VJ. I think after that, Capitol took the challenge. But they still would not take albums that were being made by their companies in the UK. And we went over there, and again, the cheesecakes become important, because I said, why don't we bring gifts? And we brought cheesecakes. We would go across, Seymour and I would go across to London with a dozen Jewish cheesecakes. And we go in and we say, I have a gift for you. Do you have any records? And they would give us records, and we wouldn't pay anything for releasing them. We could release them in the United States and Canada. David, that's Canada. Yes, Canada is a place too, you know. So we picked up a band called the Climax Blues Band. We went to other labels. We even released a Cliff Richard single, Barclay James Harvest. We brought them back to the United States, released them on Sire, and lo and behold, they were accepted. And why? Because technology reared its head again in my life. The signal changed from AM to FM. FM became an important part of our listening process. Why was FM important? FM was important because it was in stereo. And here we were, Sire Records has great blues albums, great classic albums, and we're releasing them, and radio stations across the country are playing entire sides of the record. All of a sudden, on one of our trips in the Netherlands, we get offered a group called Focus. Focus, we put out the first album, nothing happens. We then get our friend Mike Vernon from our partnership label, Blue Horizon, to produce it. And he comes up with a song called Hocus Pocus. Hocus Pocus becomes #1 in many places across the world. And it literally is Sire's first #1 record. And that led to success at Sire. But again, after a period of time, Seymour and I, because of personal differences, had a parting of the ways. And it leads me to deciding, maybe I'll just do something else, until somebody tells me, did you hear about what's happening down at this club on the Lower East Side called CBGB's? Yep, knew nothing about it. I go down to CB's, I meet Hilly, I start listening to the music, and the scene is so exciting that all of a sudden you feel like you're back in the Brill Building. You're back in the 60s. You're back at a place where you can invent things.
Do you remember who you saw the first time you stepped into CBGB's?
Yeah, I saw Talking Heads, which I know, as great as they were and as great as David is now. If anybody, I don't know about the film, the HBO thing that came out, but seeing the show live, if we ever get Broadway again, David Byrne, I mean, it was absolutely fabulous. Psycho Chicken. That was, Psycho Killer. Psycho Chicken was, what's his name?
Big House.
Big House. But Psycho Killer, Qu'est-ce que c'est, fa, 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 fa. Loved it. I also saw Blondie. What else? The Heartbreakers. In the Heartbreakers was Richard Hell. Richard Hell turned out to be, to me, the symbol of what punk music literally stood for. And they say that Malcolm McLaren used to sit down at CB's, watch Richard perform, went back to the UK and put together the Sex Pistols. And Richard was a prime influence to that. Eventually, I got a chance to sign him. And what we did was we recorded a classic album that didn't sell zillions, but is well known to people who love that period, Blank Generation. And Blank Generation, I thought Blank Generation would be the anthem for that period of time. It didn't turn out to be, but it turned out to be something that lives beyond that time. And wherever I go, people always ask me about it. One night I'm at CB's and Hilly comes over to me and says, as somebody who wants to meet you, she hears you're doing a composite album of things from down here, which is what I wanted to do. And introduces me to Deborah Harry. And, like to be on my record. I said, well, I don't work with everybody. Of course, at that time, I was thinking of working with everybody. I said, let me hear you play for me in rehearsal. I set up a rehearsal, and from the second I walked in to when we finally talked about doing something together, I grinned from ear to ear. Why? The songs were so great. These are songs on the first album and the second album, Blondie albums, which are more punk driven before they had the #1 Heart of Glass. But the songs were still great. Their ability to try to bring something out of them was so amazing that you could feel them trying. You could feel them. So you had the songs, you could feel them, the musicians, and you could just get into her from that first second. The way she looked, but the way she sang, the way she convinced you with the style of her performance and her voice. And eventually we had the first pseudo hit off of the first album that turned out to be, I think it was #1 in Australia. It was a song called In the Flesh. And the important thing about that was not that it sold in Australia, but that it showed you the international potential of Blondie, and overall reinforced to me the reality of the international potential that existed from the time Seymour and I first started going to the UK. And the records came out all over the world, and it just opened the world more and more to American music.
That's great. When Sire signed the Ramones, it's probably the most important rock label signing of the last 40 years. It established Sire as an edgy, incredible label. Do you think the signings that followed a few short years later from the Pretenders and even Madonna would have happened if you hadn't signed the Ramones?
I think that I think it put Sire in a position where it seemed like an innovator, because when the Ramones was signed, it was brought to us by a guy that I had met in Florida and who worked with Seymour and I at Sire, Craig Leon, and who's a great producer in his own right, and worked with me on the Blondie records and other records during that period. I think it established Sire as a label that could stand on its own independently, even though it was distributed. We had always been distributed by different companies, and at that time was distributed by Warner's, but and is still distributed through Warner's. But yes, it influenced probably the Pretenders wanting to pay attention. Certainly, Talking Heads felt comfortable about it. I brought Richard Hell and the Voidoids back there. And it established that identity, but then Seymour started going to the UK on an ongoing basis again, and Depeche Mode, traveling around the world, going to different places. So it had a welcoming aspect to independent artists that wanted an extra edge. It had an edge. Yeah, that's the important thing. It had an edge.
So in the 80s, you started working with a scrappy punk band called the Go-Go's,
Yeah.
and you created a power pop masterpiece, or at least a classic. So how did that evolve?
Oh,
And tell me your favorite Go-Go story.
well, very simply, I got called by Miles Copeland, who we had worked with, the Climax Blues Band, Renaissance. He was a manager, and he had started a record company called IRS Records, and he and his brother had an agency called FBI. Their father was one of the founders of the CIA, so it made absolute sense for him and his brother to have those government agency shortened form names for their ventures. But Miles called me, and at first I wasn't interested because I'd worked with girl groups from the very beginning, and I really was looking for something different. But their manager, Ginger Canzaneri, called over and over again. And I kept saying no, but she said, listen, they're playing down at Loeb Student Center at NYU. It's not far from you. I know you're up on the Upper West Side. Can you just come down and listen to them? I think you'll like it. I went down, same experience as I had with Blondie that night. What was it? Well, their ability to perform was great. Each one of those girls was great on stage, and they had a great drummer, Gina Schock. And of course, Belinda was amazing. All of them were great. And the songs. Once again, the songs. Only thing that matters to me, the songs. So I said yes, but I said, why don't they come to New York and make the record? There might be more energy. And I had a budget. I don't remember what it was, but it was pretty slight. And went in and started making the records. And I had to sit and talk with each one of them, about, Kathy says in her book, I told her, she says, well, what do you want me to play in the bass? So I said, well, play the same thing the bass drum plays, you know. And she said it took her a long time to get out of that and beginning to play the bass again later on. But it makes the bottom of the record feel better. I would rent different guitars from them. So each instrument joined together. Remember, it was stereo and mono at that time. Stereo wasn't a huge thing. So you still made mono recordings, and then you mixed them in stereo so the record company could sell it twice. Essentially, that was it. The record went on the radio in mono, a pop single, but stereo was important for the record company to have another venue stream. The point of that is, as the record's being made, it stops being a punk record to me. The songs were so great, especially the one I really loved, All Lips Are Sealed. And I called the record company and they said, well, you're out of your budget. And I wound up paying for finishing the record myself, which could have been half of what the budget was again. Miles tells the story, he recognizes it. And I did never get it back, except I got it back in royalties because the record sold tons. And then, just to show you, the band had already put out an EP that sold fairly well in Los Angeles punk circles. And on it was We Got the Beat. So when the time came to record that as part of the album, I said, well, let's do it. And said, no, I'm not going to do that. It's already been out. I said, really? What do you mean it's been out? I mean, I know you sold fairly well, but it's not the best recording. And how many did it sell? And I looked it up. It sold around 40,000, which is pretty amazing for a punk EP at those days. And I said, you know something? How many billions of people are there in this world? Why don't we just do it again? Let me show you how to do it differently. And I slowed it down like I did everything with all their songs, slowed it down, double or triple the drums, because if you got a beat, you got to hear the beat. And Gina did it, sounded great. They went home to LA. I mixed the record with Rob Freeman, my engineer at the time, and sent it to them. Well, Miles threatened to kill me. The band didn't talk to me for 6 months. It was, you've ruined the punk aesthetic. I said, well, I don't think so, you know. And then 6, 8 months later, after it had already been #1 for, I think, 8 weeks, they talked to me again. And we became friends. And they understood that punk is an aesthetic and a feeling and an attitude. It doesn't mean it has to not be contemporary and pop at the same time. And that's what made Blondie great. That's what made the Go-Go's great. That's what made Talking Heads great. They went into R&B. And, you know, you get the mixture of these things. Attitude is important. The song is essential. And then your ability as an artist or a band or a musician to execute it and tell that story is what makes success.
All right, last question before we go on to the orchard. When you've described your producing style in our many conversations, you always talk about your desire to capture that magic moment. What are some of the things that you do with the artists you work with to coax the very best performances out of them to get those magic moments?
Well, I mean, I used to do it. I guess I still do if we ever get back into a studio again. You know, we said with no virus talk, but you know, we're not in a studio. We do everything remotely. Well, first of all, the personal eye-to-eye contact's really important. What I used to do, and I still do from time to time, if there's some difficulty getting the message across, I ask the artist, the vocalist, to recite the lyric, to make me understand it and believe it in a conversational form.
So they
Um,
say it instead of singing it.
yeah, say it instead of singing it. You know, I mean, they didn't have to do it, the Angels, but it would be, my boyfriend's back and you're going to be in trouble. Hey la, hey la. Now it sounds comical, but tell me the story. Where did it come from? Why are you saying these words? And if they're more meaningful words like, I believe we're on the eve of destruction, you know, the Barry Maguire from years ago, we might be, but if you're going to sing it for me and I can't believe you, tell it to me. And when I believe you, now sing it. So that's a technique. I'm sure a lot of people use that. I mean, I didn't learn it from anybody, but that's about that.
Well, that helps singers connect with the message, and song lyrics aren't always poetically sophisticated, but
Mhm.
they move us because of the context and because of the delivery, and you get better delivery out of those artists. So time is fleeting as expected. So we're going to skip over to what the hell you were thinking in the 90s when you and Scott had founded an independent music distributor called The Orchard, and somehow magically seen the digital potential on the
Yeah, well,
horizon.
the first thing is the last thing I ever wanted to be was a distributor. Having started in the beginning of the music business and see how distribution works, well, you when you're an independent, you put out music. I mean, for the most part, distributors were, shall we say, late in paying, and I didn't want to be one of them. I didn't find that the creative aspect there. I'm more interested in the creative side of the business. Um, what happened with Scott and I is we formed a small record company called Soul 3 Records. Uh, we had become friends by then, and we decided we were going to be. Scott was an artist manager, by the way, just so you know he is. He's a successful person in his own right. He and I, for years, were partners and worked at the Orchard. Scott now is with another company, and I'm sure he's doing the best for them the way he would have done for us. And I'm sure Warner's appreciates all his efforts. Um, the, um, the story of the Orchard is really pretty simple. we we had this record company. At the same time, we were using a few computers with interns running them in a small office we had on Orchard Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And one day we begin to see that there are record stores on the internet. The internet that's operating at 16 point something, 30, not even 33 yet. And remember, it's no broadband. And the stores were Music Boulevard and CD Now, those two stores. So call them up. We want to get our records distributed through those stores. They tell us why they can't take them. And they didn't tell us why. They said, we can't take them. And I asked why. And they told me that they were just virtual fronts, which I began to learn a new term, a virtual front, because the back end was supplied by a place in Sacramento called Valley. Valley was the largest one-stop distributor in America for all the major labels. They had about 250,000 titles. Well, those titles could then be available through a virtual front. Pick, pack, and ship. Thank you for buying from CD Now. Thank you for buying from Music Boulevard, and eventually Amazon, and then history. We went out there, made a deal with them, and here's where the past becomes important. And I know I've told this story before, but I'll say it again. Gave him a brilliant idea of being the supplier to them of all the independent music. Great idea, right? Well, they weren't that interested. What they wanted to talk to me about was CBGB's, Blondie, the Go-Go's, My Boyfriend's Back, I Want Candy. And after I talked to them about it, they said to me and Scott, you know, you're one of us. We could be a team. Let's do this. And we became, the orchard became the distributor for all independent content into their system. Therefore, if you came through any of those online stores, you signed to the orchard put you in. It's pretty simple. And we started going with it. And we started shipping, taking orders. We built a warehouse. We kept taking orders from Valley, shipping it to them. They shipped it out, all physical. However, Scott and I would sit around and say, you know, this has been going on for years. What happens if the process changes? If the concept, because you read about it, of broadband happens? What happens if things can be downloaded? Things can change. How do we adjust to those changes? And in our agreement, we put a clause that you not only send us the records and we distribute them for you to these stores physically, you give us the right to distribute your music digitally as well. And from that, it took until 2003, I mean, 6 or 7 years after the orchard, Scott and I founded the orchard and were working day and night at it, that iTunes comes along. At that point, we had taken investment, we had money, we could distribute more than 150,000 titles to iTunes immediately, and then just started growing from there and participating in conventions and traveling throughout the world. We would go, Scott and I could cross from Asia all across Australia. I would talk and give lectures in Australia. We speak in front of people, some of who believed us and didn't want to hear what we were saying about digital because they didn't want the physical world to go away. And we would wind up at places like the Midem, at Midem. And at Midem, we would bring, we had by that time, which is probably 2003, 2005, we had about 30 different offices. We would bring all those offices together, have our conference there. We could use the conference and meet them to acquire more and more labels from around the world because they all gathered into one place. And it expanded our base, and it made us a larger entity. We now have offices in 48 different places. They're solely orchard offices. We're now a solely owned Sony entity. The great thing about the relationship with Sony is they allow us to exist and encourages us to deal with our labels and artists in an independent fashion. The wonderful thing about the orchard is it started off to serve the independent community. It still does, but it does it in a much broader way. It delivers technology, it delivers knowledge, it delivers information, and it delivers creative energy and suggestions on how you could be the best you could be. Whatever we at the Orchard could help you, our label friends, with, we're there to do. And we expand that every single day. So when I talk about it and I think about Alan Freed on the radio in the Orchard, in the digital future and whatever comes next, I'm there as long as I'm alive. I mean, I've always done this and I can't think of anything better to do. And I hope I stay lucky for the next 100 years.
Well, what do you see coming on the horizon? What do you see in the future? How are things going to be similar? How are they going to be different?
Well, I hope writers and publishers get paid well again. I'm not going to point a finger at anybody, but that's an important aspect of of what the future should be. What I'd like to see is a bit more of an education for people that enter the business, looking back as well as just listening to what is today. So it gives you a richer understanding. I think the fact that the orchard lived when it developed into the entity that it is today, that successful entity, that my knowledge of the past enabled us to exist in the future and in the present and dream of the future. So we didn't just jump. You need to have a solid base in order to get to the next step. And I think AI and you and I talked about some of the companies that are doing the performance venues. I mean, that's where it's really going to make a difference. Some of the again, Billie Eilish. I mean, and artists actually selling these virtual experiences that are created in such a fascinating, interesting, futuristic way, will enhance the delivery, sale of music in general. But the rest of it goes back to the same old thing. You got a great song, you have a chance of doing something special with it. If it's an ordinary, semi-boring thing, you really can't market it into much. But you need to be something. You have to have an attitude, and that's reality. And I think the future is bright. I love the past, but I am more interested in the future.
That's great, Richard. Thank you, everyone who sent the comments and questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance. You know, Richard's got a lot of awesome stories to tell, and our unique presentation here with one camera and one laptop has compromised our multitasking abilities, but I'll try and get you some answers after the fact. Richard, I just want to say, you know, when my band in Montreal sent you our demos in the 80s because of who you would produce, and one of our two lead singers was Sass Jordan, who became a big star in Canada. Never thought that 20 years later you'd be moving next door, even if you never did answer.
Well, no, yeah. Those were the days, by the way. Unless you got it from an attorney, you didn't listen. No, the truth is, I'll just say something really quickly. Those attorneys that are on the line there, that's how a lot of lawsuits started, by the way. People would, you must know that, people would send something, and then you might write a song, and they would claim you got it from listening to my demo. So for a while, record companies and people were cautious about responding, even if they listened to it. And the last thing I'll say, well, thank you all for listening. I have a tendency, maybe with the stories, to ramble, but if anyone wants to reach me, if this is okay to say, just I'm richard@theorchard.com. I've been that since the first day the Orchard started. It'll be my email until I'm no longer there, but for now I'm there for a long time. And feel free to write me. I'm more than happy now to just write you back and tell you what I think of anything. Okay? And thanks a lot for listening.
I could listen to this
and thanks,
all
Tom.
day.
Appreciate it.
I could listen to Richard for many more hours. If we were in a physical space, I'd tell everyone to stand up and applaud him, but I'll just do it myself. Thank you, Richard.
Oh, thank you,
Thanks,
David.
man.
And David, thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you, and thank you, Tom. Thanks, David.
Let me jump in and say the final wrap up to both of you, David and to Richard. Thank you for sharing your time and your wisdom. I have a feeling there's going to be part 2 to this conversation, because I know we left a lot of stories in the green room, so to speak. So Richard, get ready for coming back later on. To the audience, thank you for your time and attention. If you've got time tomorrow, please join us at the exact same time, 2 o'clock Eastern. Tomorrow's guests are Amit Zappa, Frank's son, talking about the new Zappa documentary that comes out at Thanksgiving weekend, and Bill Gubbins, who is a photographer inside the Zappa family, shall we say. It's going to be a great event for anybody that enjoyed Frank Zappa and all his amazing creativity. Finally, to everyone else, just stay safe.